where her primary role is overseeing the design, implementation, and management of the Ready to Learn program. She has a bachelor's in integrated marketing communications from Duquesne and a master's in adult learning and training from Argosy. She is finishing the EDD program at Pitt studying urban education. Before coming to Pitt, Brentley served as director of admissions and financial aid at NAS Prep, an innovative independent school. Just as Cassandra began her work at Pitt, she agreed to attend a We the People Math Alliance conference in DC without quite knowing what that might lead to. Kari Kokka is an assistant professor of mathematics education at the Department of Instruction and Learning at University of Pittsburgh. She is co-founder of the Creating Balance in an Unjust World Conference on STEM education and social justice, and she's the co-chair of the AERA SIG Critical Educators for Social Justice. Previously, she was a high school math teacher and a math coach for 10 years in New York City before completing her doctorate at Harvard. Kari began leading us all in justice work immediately when she arrived on the Pitt campus, organizing a group to support immigrant youth, and then organizing a social justice fair. Cassandra and Kari.
Thank you so much, Dr. Roop, for that wonderful introduction, as well as your personal stories about Bob Moses. It was really, really beautiful. Thank you for sharing that with us. Cassandra and I wanted to start with a land acknowledgement. So we begin our discussion today, first and foremost, by expressing our deep gratitude to the stewardship of the lands we currently occupy by many generations of Native American, Indigenous, and First Nations peoples who are still here today. We acknowledge that we benefit from the stolen and unceded lands upon which we live and work, and that our presence on such lands contributes to so instead of histories, I say their stories and our stories, of imperialism, forced removal of property, life, language, culture, spirit, and so on. We acknowledge that our country's, their story and our story is entangled with the enslavement of Black Americans whose labor constructed the buildings, roads, infrastructures, industries, and wealth of the United States today. We honor the lives of those lost, who struggled and continue to struggle against settler colonialism and white supremacy. We commit to dismantling interlocking systems of oppression to work toward freedom and liberation. We commit to learning about rematriation of the land for Indigenous communities and reparations for Black Americans. We commit to honor the land and strive to be in right relation with ourselves, with each other, and our more than human relatives. So I'm going to pass to Cassandra, who's going to introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Dr. Kokka, and thank you, Dr. Roop, for the wonderful introduction to our time together today. I'm so grateful that we have with us today 3 panelists who are intimately connected to Bob Moses and his work, and we are excited to hear from you all today. First, we have Maisha Moses, who is the daughter of Bob Moses and the executive director of the Young People's Project, where her work focuses on broadening the participation of groups underrepresented in science, mathematics, engineering, and technology. We're so excited to hear more about your work more broadly today. Next, we have Cliff Freeman. He is director of STEM programs of the Young People's Project and PhD student studying mathematics and science at Boston University. Cliff became interested in education for himself and his community in the 10th grade when he and his peers worked with Bob Moses to strategize how to demystify mathematics concepts related to YPP's signature game Flagway. And then we also have Albert Sykes with us today, the executive director of the Institute for Democratic Education in America. Albert has a powerful personal story, one that is rooted in the struggles and searches for quality education through community organizing and youth advocacy. The proud father of 4 sons, Albert grew up in the Shady Oaks community around the corner from where NAACP member and civil rights activist Medgar Evers lived and died. So we welcome you all to this conversation that we will have today. in sharing more about the life and legacy of Bob Moses and the work that remains due to the strong foundation that he built.
Okay, so for our first question, we're just really, really excited to have the three of you. Really thank you for your time today. And we also wanted to offer our condolences to Maisha and your family, and to Cliff and Albert, you know, who work with him so closely. And we wanted to start off, Maisha, if you would be willing to give some reflections around the life and legacy of your father, if you're willing. I know that, you know, this is very much also like the work of your whole family, like your mother, Janet, right? And so we just wanted to give you some space to be able to share what you'd be willing to share with our audience today.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for having us and for putting this on. It's wonderful to see you all. So when I think about my dad's work and the legacy of his work, I remember a time when I was in high school, and I think I had become or started to become more aware of his history. And so I asked him what the movement had meant to him. And he said, he thought for a second and he said, freedom. And he said it so strongly and so powerfully. It just resonated with me. And I think he found himself in the movement. And so his decision to go south in 1960 and to give his life to the movement really changed and shaped the arc of his whole life. And that was the big theme for him, really, was freedom. And as a Black child and an African child growing up in America, a Black man, sort of figuring out how to find your place in, 1950s and 60s American society, the movement was an answer to a very deep searching that he had gone through across his childhood and young adulthood. And so later, when he started the Algebra Project was an opportunity to marry his love of math, because his studies were in mathematics and actually in the philosophy of mathematics. So he had that love, that very natural love, but his life was about freedom. And so the Algebra Project was a marriage of, those big two themes in his life. And I guess the other thing that I can say, he used to always tell us that, you can live a life in struggle, that facing the weight of our country's history and what we're still having to navigate as we work our way through the legacy of the country's history. I think for him, what the movement taught him and what the elders in the movement taught him is that as a Black person in America, you really can live a meaningful life in struggle, and that what it takes to make change in this country is that sort of ongoing, enduring, consistent commitment to struggle and figuring out how to struggle, figuring out how to build, to find your friends, right? To figure out who your friends are in partnership in the struggle, and to find those people, and to learn how to come together, to work together, to name a problem, to craft a solution to that problem. So those in very broad strokes, like without getting into like specific details about his history, which I think so many of us know. I think as I think about the arc of his life and his legacy, that's what's really sitting with me right now.
Thank you. And do you think that, you know, like you and your siblings being in school in Cambridge and, you know, the experiences that you were having influenced this arc of his work?
Of my dad's work? Yeah, so what he saw in, as he was, as a parent, just trying to ensure that we got a good education, was he saw the ways in which education, and it's very explicit in mathematics, but education functions to sort people and continues to be a deep manifestation of America's caste system. And so as soon as he started as soon as he saw that, and basically what happened was that he wanted me to learn math. He came into my classroom to teach me because I was tired of doing math with him at home. So he came into my classroom and he became my algebra teacher in the 8th grade. And I was the only Black student in the highest level math class. We were sorted into ability groups, and the ability groups just fell along race and class lines. So this was decades ago. Cambridge is still struggling. This is Cambridge Public Schools. We're still struggling with this issue, as is the whole country is struggling with this issue. And so he saw the ways in which Black children and poor children, Latino children were not getting access to the highest levels of mathematics education that their school districts were offering. And he also saw and understood back in the 80s when he was getting the algebra project off the ground, that math literacy was becoming as just as an important a literacy as reading and writing literacy on the eve of the 21st century. I think he was in a sense prescient about that, or ahead of his time about that, because he, I think, was one of the earliest people to start talking about math literacy as a civil right in a 21st century knowledge-driven, technology-driven economy. And so he understood, and he used to use a really great metaphor that for young people today who don't get mathematics education, they will be like serfs on a plantation back in the first half of the 20th century. That it really was, when you talk about what are the obstacles that this generation is facing in terms of freedom and access and equity, he saw very early that math literacy is key to that in a way that I think a lot of people, most people just weren't thinking about it in that way.
Yeah, I know that, you know, amongst critical math teacher circles, you know, we consider Bob Moses as the pioneer. Bob Moses is the GOAT. You know, that's, I mean, I guess that's like the greatest of all time, right? And so, so yeah, I mean, he's just such a giant and an icon. So, you know, thank you so much for sharing your stories about, you know, growing up with your dad. And we wanted to ask all three of you about how your relationship with Maisha, in your case, your father, Cliff and Albert, you know, with Bob Moses, shapes the work that you do now, you know, and the vision that you have for freedom and justice. And so Maisha, we'll start with you since.
I would say patience. I think I learned mostly what I learned from him. I just learned by watching and being around him. And I feel very privileged to have worked with him like long into my adulthood, and just spent a lot of time being around him as he worked. And so he just had a way of being with people, working with people, meeting people where they are, wherever that is, and being able to connect with them where they are, but then also connect where they are and enable them to connect to this really big vision and sort of, I don't know, epic struggle that his life was about, and help them to see, right, how it would be meaningful for their life, right, to connect their lives to this broader struggle. And he did it. It was in the way he worked with a child one-on-one, doing math, or with a group of students. The way he gave talks, I would say that that's a lot of what I carry with me and shapes how I do my work. And then, of course, with the Young People's Project, I think it was his communicating to us that his understanding of movement and his understanding of this movement that we're in today is that movement requires the people who are most directly affected by the problem to make a demand on their own behalf, but also struggle and organize to figure out solutions to the problem. And in education, that's the children, that's the young people. And so he just really drummed that message into my brother Omo, who started YPP, Albert and his classmates who at that time were in middle school, that their role, their work, their energy in this project and in this work is critical, it's essential. And so that's the heart and soul and the essence of what the Young People's Project does, is figure out how to create spaces where, with that intent in mind, that young people have to be at the center of making change in education. And obviously not the only people, it's gonna take everybody, but without them, it's not sufficient.
Thank you so much. And Maisha, do you want to invite, so I'm a teacher, so you can choose, who do you want to go next, Cliff or Albert, to answer the same question about how your relationship with Bob Moses shapes your work?
So I'll go chronologically. So Albert, I'll pass it to Albert. Albert needs no introduction. Albert became part of the family in Mississippi when the Algebra Project was getting off the ground there, and when the Young People's Project was getting off the ground there. And he's come up through both organizations and taken everything that he has learned and experienced and just taken it beyond. So I try to keep up with Albert.
Thank you, Maisha. Good to see you. For me, I think the thing that struck me first and most about Bob was this ability to capture the story in its full truth and to be intent about exposing the full truth of the who in every venue that he was able to. So I remember years of being frustrated with trying to figure out how to know more about Bob by asking him things about himself. And Bob had this habit of saying, well, Fannie Lou Hamer did this, and Mega Evers had this particular infrastructure in place, and CC Bryant drove me and introduced me to this person or that person, that Amzie Moore had connections that he took Bob and other people too. And so like I would come out of every story asking him about him, knowing so much more about 5, 6, 10, or 11 other people, right? And I would be like frustrated, like, well, I don't know no more about you. But when I reached my early 20s is when I realized that Bob was exemplifying how much of the story about you is not about you, but it's about the people and the places and the things that precede you. And I always go back to this quote that I found online that says, I understand that I'm not here because of the path that lies before me, but because of the path that lies behind. And I saw Bob live that out, where he always paid homage to the folks who made possible the way for him to do the work that he was able to do with the people that he was able to do it with. Looking at the influence of Ella Baker and how intertwined their lives were. Bob is a little kid in Harlem, and their family is selling milk as part of a co-op, and Ella Baker is part of the co-op movement in New York. And just looking at just how divine, it seems that all of his movements and connections were. Way before he came to the South, you could look at different increments of Bob's life and always think that he reached the ceiling. He was Frank and Lyman's tutor. He went and worked in Belgium and in France. And he came and he taught at the Horace Mann School. And, you know, this all prior to coming to the South. And then even if you take his time in the Civil Rights Movement and then going to Tanzania and starting a family and coming back and finishing up his doctorate, like it's so many times that you could have said that that was just a full life story. But what Bob exemplified in front of us every day was that there was always more to do, always more to get, always more to learn, always more to seek, and always more of yourself to give. So I think that when Bob transitioned from his body, that was simply the only transition other than what he had been transitioning all his life was his knowledge and his wisdom and his power and his place for people to live into their best selves. And so Bob transitioned out of his body, but he had been giving us the transition since we were 11 and 12-year-old kids, and Maisha and Omo and them, and his children, you know, way before he ever come into contact with us. So I learned from him how to live in truth, how to capture the full story and be intent about sharing the full story. And then also that for every feeling that someone else could dictate for you, you always had the opportunity to break through, and not in a selfish way, but in a selfless way, where that every accomplishment was another barrier breaker. It was another door opener. It was another way for you to step in the gap and not be a gatekeeper, but a gateway. And that's what I felt like Bob lived out in front of us for so long. And I guess with Cliff coming up next, I just want to say he gave us as teenage kids and early 20-something kids the opportunity to impact our legacy and what people would know of us in our community at ages that most people would think that we were too young to be able to handle these things and think about these things and explore these things. And so the beauty of meeting somebody when you're 11 and then looking up, and I'm 38, and I already knew Cliff was next in the pipeline, and Cliff knows you know, the young people that's coming behind him, because it was several young people in Mississippi that I was fortunate enough to work with before I ever knew Cliff, and just looking at this generational pipeline that we've been able to build with young people who start off in a program and they start off as part of some programmatic function, and we end up as this nationwide and in some cases worldwide family of folks that take care of each other. And so Cliff is one of those people that I look at and that I'm proud of and that I'm happy to see be here. And so Cliff, I think that's my intro of.
Yeah, thanks, Albert. So I didn't know, so in 2010 is when I met Bob, and I didn't know of this pipeline. I didn't know that I was gonna, as Albert said, be up next. So like in my intro, I was talking about, well, it was read that I met Bob when we were strategizing about some math ideas. And so this was in Boston, in Cambridge. I was going to school in Boston, and my peers and I, so we were 10th grade, 11th grade, 12th graders, some of us were 9th graders. And we would plan after school every day to, you know, try to teach what our game called Flagway after school to elementary and middle school students. And we were having some trouble, like, you know, many educators do, you know, teaching new concepts. So we were having some trouble trying to figure out how to teach, how to demystify what we were basically trying to teach the students. And so in this particular cohort of young people that the Young People's Project hired that year, it was a big influx of us. So it must have been about 25 like new math literacy workers. And so one random week, it was like a span of like 3 weeks. Periodically, some older gentlemen started to hang out with us, and he just hung out in the back of the room and was just listening. He kind of just listened for like a week, right? And you know, no one actually said anything to him because he just walked in, sat down, and listened. And when we were done, he would go. It was like 2 weeks into the you know, us planning and teaching young people. Where he spoke up and he introduced himself. He says his name is Bob Moses. He's Maisha's mom, almost dad, Maisha's dad. And you know, we didn't know Bob Moses. We knew Omo and Maisha though, because they were the co-directors of YPP. And he asked us. He was like, "Well, I see you guys are having trouble, you know, explaining some math to the young people that you're trying to teach." And he was saying, well, if you change the, you know, basically he was saying, if you change the language to a language that the students understand, you know, will you be able to do that? Will it be able to work? And we decided, we was like, yeah, I guess so. And then he just simply was saying, you know, so that's what you should do. Just try that. So almost instantly, when we went to, you know, back to the schools, we decided to use a lot more of the young people's feedback and using the things that they enjoy, things that they talk about into our math programs. And almost instantly, the students started to get math. And so this question about, well, how has Bob influenced my life, my work, and, you know, everything that, you know, surrounds me is, and one of the reasons why I think I got really close with Bob was, I think we both like to try to solve problems that we have a vision for, that it has a possible, you know, sunny day and at the end of it. So this phrase, which is in his book, Radical Equations, if we can do it, then we should. So, you know, we knew that if we changed the language that we were using, that we can, you know, we can see progress. But we were just wrapped into, you know, the mathematics and how we learned it at school. And so, you know, throughout my time with Bob, you know, learning from him, strategizing with him, we always, you know, throw ideas at one another and trying to figure out, well, how can we do more for students who basically have been excluded from, you know, quality math instruction to make, ramps for young people to get algebra. So my background is in computer science, and we worked a whole bunch on how we can use computer science as a ramp into algebra. So this saying, if we can do it, then we should, has really, propelled me and carried me through, work with Bob, working with the Young People's Project, the National Alliance. And, I just, if it wasn't for Bob, I think, and also the Young People's Project, a lot of what I think part of this country wouldn't be the way it is. We're relatively small, but I think we made a really big impact with the young people and the people down on the ground that are really having these problems, especially with education. So yeah, Bob is, as you're saying, the GOAT in many ways.
Thank you, Maisha, Cliff, and Albert for sharing. I think all of us that got the opportunity to listen can really see the love and the family aspect of doing the work and being in the movement. So we just really appreciate getting the opportunity to hear your reflections.
And so I'll ask the next question, and kind of just to echo what Dr. Roop shared. When I had the opportunity to spend that time with you all, this is the summer of 2019, had no idea the magnitude of the wonderful work that you all were doing and how it would impact me coming back to Pittsburgh in the Ready to Learn program and having the opportunity to work with Dr. Kokka that summer and infusing social justice math into our work. And so I would love to know more about the work that you're currently doing, or the work that you've done in the past with the Algebra Project, the Young People's Project, the We Are the People Alliance, the National Math Literacy Corps, and just other work that you might be engaged in. I'm sure it's far reaching, even probably beyond those projects, that you might share with the audience today, to really demonstrate how the depth of how you're really impacting this algebra for all movement. And I'll let whomever would like to start with that question.
So I can start and then pass it on to Cliff and Albert. So as the Young People's Project grew out of the Algebra Project, through the 80s and into the early 90s, went around the country and ended up working in about, 13 states and maybe 25 school districts around the country, focused on middle school mathematics and ensuring that all children took algebra by the 8th grade, and organizing communities around the schools and working with teachers and principals to provide professional development so that they could teach the math differently and have policies around who gets access to the math to support that broader goal of everybody getting algebra. And the Algebra Project, I think, has made a huge contribution to the world of math education through its curricular process and pedagogy, which takes ordinary events or experiences that people have, that children have, and goes through a process to abstract the mathematics out of those events. And when I remember when I was training and teaching with the Algebra Project, so many teachers said, if I had learned math this way, then I would understand it. And so I think that was a really significant intellectual contribution to the field of math education that the Algebra Project made, but then also marrying it, as we've been talking about, to citizenship and broader issues of equity. And so the Young People's Project inherited that. It inherited that way of thinking about algebra as a right, and it also inherited the pedagogy, this approach to math, around grounding it in experiences, games, and activities, and using language, as Cliff was talking about earlier. Like, what's the language that you're using to talk about math that's accessible to students, that will enable students to have conversations about math and how math is expressing itself in their day-to-day experiences. So the Young People's Project inherited that and applied it to this idea of developing young people as teachers and as facilitators of mathematics. And so this idea of knowledge work or entry-level knowledge work, that there's an incredibly powerful and meaningful role that young people can uniquely play in terms of learning bits and pieces of math well enough to teach it to their peers, but in a way that's challenging the more traditional approaches to math learning and teaching that aren't working for so many folks. And in doing that, they're making a demand on the system. And so YPP has developed a number of initiatives and programs over the years that are focused on this near peer math learning and teaching. And I can sort of let Cliff talk a little more about that. And then the Alliance, the We the People Alliance, and I'll let Albert sort of chime in wherever he feels most comfortable. I think as, well, in any case, I'll just say this about the Alliance. As I think of the problem, and I think as we've learned to think about the problem, how you're really like chipping away at a very deep and complex a social issue. The National Science Foundation, I think it was 2015, came up with a new initiative called NSF Includes. And what they said was that this question of diversity in STEM is an issue of national importance. And the problem is too deep, it's too big, it's too complex for a solution to be just scaling one particular approach to the problem, even if it's an approach that works, right? It's not enough just to scale programs and approaches. And it's not enough to just try to find the approaches that work, but that's what's needed is some sort of alliance and some sort of collective action and community building around the project. And so the We the People Math Literacy for All Alliance was an answer to that call that the National Science Foundation put out. And basically what the Young People's Project and the Algebra Project, the institutions around the country that had become part of the Algebra Project network have been chipping away over the last 3 or 4 years to think about, well, what does it mean to develop an alliance, to become an alliance that has the goal of ensuring that all children leave high school such that mathematics is not an obstacle to any choice of career or any choice of academic study. So that was sort of an overview of 3 of the organizations. And I think Albert and Cliff can provide maybe some more details about that. And I didn't touch yet on the Math Literacy Corps. I think you asked about that as well. And so maybe Cliff can talk about that.
Yeah, so there's alliance is one thing, that's a big thing. One when Bob used to tell us, he used to tell stories to us usually in public spaces where he would say, oh, when people ask him, how do you get, these young people to, be great at math, the young people that you're teaching. And he would tell them that there will be two things. The first thing is that the students have to know a little bit of math. And the second thing is you have to be able to get their attention. And he would say the second was always the most difficult. So I think the Young People's Project, the organization, and the mission and vision of the place, of the organization, is sort of the solution to the second question, the second answer. You got to be able to get their attention, because everything that we do at the Young People's Project, it's fun, it's engaging, and it's a fresh breath of fresh air in math education. So for example, our signature math game is called Flagway, and students are uncovering cross-cutting concepts in mathematics, and I don't want to give too much about Flagway, and because there's a whole arc that you have to go through before you can crack the code and things. But it's based on a function called the Mobius function, and students are throughout this whole time of trying to understand the mathematics, there are games situated in the number one asset at ensuring that this thing is fun is that it's young people in near peer cascading structure, close in age, teaching the subjects. So what's more cool than the ninth grader or the 10th grader when you're a 7th grade, 8th grader? What's more cooler than that? And so it's worked. And for 25 years, YPP is celebrating its 25-year anniversary. And in the number, and like I was saying earlier, feedback, and listening to the people who are on the ground having the problem really powers, that engine. So I want to explain one thing connected. It was just one idea, how it turned into something so big and so great as it relates to the Young People's Project. So in 2017, this was when I was finishing up grad school. When I was in the middle of grad school doing a master's program. YPP was approached by the Boston Public Schools, and they asked us, well, we want to try to do computer science and math and in a school. And they basically said, well, it has to be during the school day. And, we traditionally at that point, we mainly did things after school. So it was okay, we'll try to make it work. So what we did was we created a class called Exploring STEM Literacy. So that started in 2017 at Excel High School. And the idea of the class was to do an integrated math and computer science class where the instructors of the class were not, well, there was a teacher of record, but the main instructors of the class weren't the typical run-of-the-mill teacher that you would see in a math class or even a computer science class. They were young people from the neighborhood, so they were college students who were, they were content experts in computer science. And since they work at the Young People's Project, we help them understand how, what classroom management is, what culturally relevant pedagogy is, and, how to do teaching in space. And also they get feedback from teachers that they're with. And so we created a program where about half of the year, students, the college students would teach the middle school, the high school students, all they know about computer science and math. And they package it into a program where about the next half of the year they do what's called math and coding boot camps, and they invite young people, middle school students, elementary school students, to their school, or they go to them, and then they set up booths, and students, learn from high school students this content that they probably, in most sense, won't ever actually experience throughout even high school. So it was really cool. So from that project, Bob, he kind of pulled me to the side. He was like, "What? What's this thing that you guys are doing over at that school with computer science and algebra?" He was like, "This is gold. This is genius." And I never really, Bob gets really happy and he shows it very, he shared it very rarely, especially in that way. And so we applied we submitted a proposal to the National Science Foundation to do more, inquiry in this model that we were setting up, where so we were awarded a research grant and the Computer Science for All program to basically build capacity in Boston public schools, because the issue is, especially in computer science, is there aren't any computer science teachers. So what our plan is, well, we're gonna take the next 3 years to build capacity in the district, utilizing the content experts that are already in the space, college students and young people from the Young People's Project, to build capacity in teachers, so that in 3 years we have a nice cohort, a nice healthy group of young of teachers, where now computer science can happen, and another on-ramp to proficiency in algebra. So just so when we're talking about the Alliance, this story I just told with the Alliance is stories that are happening all over into the different organization partners that's been a part of it since that includes grant and RFP was awarded that Maisha talked about. And all you have to do is ask, just ask the organizations that that are affiliated with the National Math Literacy for All Alliance, and they'll tell you their stories about how this work has proliferated in their space. So I'll pass it to Albert because I can talk about math and computer science all day.
Yeah, thanks, Cliff. So in the book Radical Equations, Bob tells a story about being in Mississippi in the 60s and walking through a community bouncing a ball, and that all the children in the community were following him because they wanted to play with the ball. They were attracted to the toy that he had. And so Bob would intentionally let the ball roll up into the yard of some adult that he wanted to be in touch with, because he knew that the adults were keeping their eyes on the kids. So as long as the kids were following him and the ball, then once he had the ball in the yard and the adult comes out to see what's happening with the young people, it opens a door for him to have a conversation with the adult about this issue of voting rights that they were working on at the time. And so that stuck with me more deeply than a lot of things with my experiences with Bob and the Algebra Project, was this idea of what is the ball, what is the toy, what is the draw that allows us to open the doors to have the conversations that's necessary for us to collectively look at the issues we want to look at and do something about, but to also build the relationships that's necessary to do that. So here at IDEA, which is the Institute for Democratic Education in America, part of what we are doing is trying to continue to bounce that ball and roll it into the yards of the people that is necessary to have the relationships and the connections and the conversations with, to do the work of the world that we've been called to do at this point in time. So looking at my experience with the Algebra Project, we had this big breakthrough with curriculum that spoke to us and lended itself to us in a way that we not only felt like valued students, but we felt like valuable people that actually had something to offer to our education versus being people um, that were trained to just take in what was given and regurgitate what was asked for. Um, and Bob and the Algebra Project gave us these chances to explore a lot of things. But the way that they got there wasn't that just that the curriculum itself was groundbreaking. It was the approach to relationship with young people. And then it was also their approach to our approach with having a relationship with this thing called mathematics, where you walk in the room and you take a general survey, and everybody, for the most part, says, I'm not good at math and I don't like it, right? And then we came from homes that said the same thing. It wasn't until I got in the Algebra Project that I realized how smart some of the older people in my family were, where you had aunties and grandmothers who could sew and cut and measure, right? And they would say that they wasn't good at math, right? And they doing a lot of this out of the top of their head. They know 1 3/4 plus 2 3/4 is whatever, and they go cut the pattern and they come out and they sew and they do whatever. My stepfather was a carpenter. I watch him write fractions all over the wall, right, from top to bottom, and they build a house. And he would say he not good at math. And what I started to understand was this conversation that Bob was having with us about relationship. It wasn't that our folks wasn't good at math; they didn't have a good relationship with math, and they didn't come from a system of education that fostered a good relationship, particularly between Black people and students of color, um, with mathematics. And so coming out of the Algebra Project and going through YPP, um, this issue of quality education as a constitutional right and looking at the things that were happening day to day with education um, led me to a place that when I became the executive director of IDEA, one of the things that we focusing on now is um, anti-racism amongst educators, right? Where it's not just how many uh, changes and leaps and bounds can we make in curriculum, but it's also in relationship when you're talking about um, people that's teaching Black children, people that's teaching children that learn English as a second language, people who teaching on native lands who don't have curriculums that respect, acknowledge, or even give any credence to native presence. And so it is about how do we find white people who committed to learning, dismantling, relearning, reliving, rethinking, and repracticing the way that they show up in this world? Because all the great curriculum and all the great programs in the world will help our children to a certain extent, but unless the mindset and the relationships change between the people who offering these things and the young people who receive these things, then what you would continue to have is some incremental progress without the necessary relationships that it takes to sustain what we see in our children to make sure that it grows and it flourishes and it prospers. So we run anti-racism courses for white educators. They are 12 2-hour sessions that happen in the spring and in the fall. And we have educators from all across the country who participate in this and who really explore these questions of race and person and community and involvement. And we trying to really drive home the importance of not just having a secret donation of Black Lives Matter, or sending a check to YPP, or sending a check to IDEA, but how willing are you to have these conversations across your kitchen table? How willing are you to show up in your classroom and not see the label that's been placed on the child, but to actually see the person that the child is? And how can that impact the way that you teach them? And then also, we working in Oregon, we have a few hundred teachers. It'll be up to like 700 teachers who will go through a restorative justice institute that's really about supporting teachers of color who working in majority white spaces, right? Where they not supported in the ways that they need to be supported mentally and instructionally so that they can also enjoy the benefits of being an educator, but a respected educator that's not just a part of the same old systems that we always been asked to buy into and be a part of and be controlled by. And then we do so many things like learning tours where we have to take people the same as Bob and other folks. You see it in Radical Equations where they talk about taking kids in Boston and putting them on the subway, or taking kids in Chicago and putting them on the escalator in the mall. And these seem like simple everyday things that you would expect these kids to have access to, but in a lot of instances, this brand new. And so some of the things that we're trying to dream up in a place like Mississippi, we actually have to take people to see this in places like Chicago and Puerto Rico and other places. And then as desperate and desolate as people would make you think Mississippi is, we also fortunate enough to bring people here to see the gifts and the beauty of what comes out of this struggle, where Bob said that you can live and struggle. And that's what we do, and that's who we are. And a lot of what our work is at IDEA is trying to be the people who build the communities who can support the visions and the dreams and the work of organizations like YPP and the Algebra Project. And to do that with some respect and dignity in the communities that we work with and serve, and to really be the truth tellers about who is bearing the brunt of the worst of what this country is pushing down and who has the solutions to overcome the brunt of the worst of what this country is putting down, and who has the power to establish and expand the definition of who is we the people.
I'm so glad that this is all being recorded, because everything right now is like mic drop moments. I appreciate so much everything that you all are sharing with us around, centering relationships, broadening definitions of mathematics, right? We're not just talking about school mathematics and dominant mathematics, and recognizing that people are doing mathematics in their everyday lives. I wanted to kind of like have us continue on that thread, and for the people who are on the call who are math educators or they work with math educators, do you have any advice for them for, if they want to try to implement some of these principles into their own classroom? Do you have any words of wisdom or suggestions for them? And I'm comfortable. Oh, we can't hear you, Maisha.
You're mute, Maisha.
It's such a broad question. I don't know exactly where to start with that question. So I think that the Algebra Project's curricular process is just incredibly powerful, and it's applicable in not just mathematics, but any scientific discipline, and really any discipline at all. And so I would encourage folks who might be interested in trying out some of what we've been talking about is to learn about the Algebra Project's 5-step process and to think about what it means to implement that. And part of what the process, in addition to structuring thinking and language about our experiences, so that we're thinking about it in a mathematical way, or the way the language of math thinks about it or talks about it, in which my dad said that, mathematics is not a language that anybody speaks. And so the thing is how to help children learn how to relate their language, their natural language, whatever it is, to the language of mathematics. That's really what the 5-step process helps you do and helps educators think about. And so that's one thing to try, but also it opens up, going back to what Albert said about relationships, who has something to say that's meaningful in the classroom, in an academic setting or context. And so the process is also a tool for democratizing who has a voice in the learning space, because everybody can have a voice about their personal experiences, right? Everybody can have something to say. And so the process is really about creating shared disciplined meaning, and a discipline meaning the meaning that comes from whatever discipline you're studying, right? So creating shared meaning in a discipline from among everybody's personal experiences. And so what the algebra project did for me, like early on in my years when I was just starting to hang out and work and support algebra project classrooms, was it just really showed me how teaching and learning should be grounded in the voices of the students, right, in the classroom. And that the teacher is not, right? It creates a real process for the teacher to be able to step out of that position of being like the source of all knowledge. So I think that's one way to think about trying to apply algebra projects work in your practice. And then when it comes to YPP, again, like for me, the heart and soul of it is empowering young people as teachers and agents of change. And I think school districts, teachers, communities don't necessarily look at the kids, especially the kids who are struggling, and see them as assets and think, okay, well, how do I need to tap into all of the strengths that they're bringing to the table to help us work on these problems that we're having, rather than continuing to see the kids themselves as the problem. And so YPP is certainly one beautiful way of doing that, but as a general principle that could be applied really in any educational setting is really how to shift your point of view of your students, and really how to, I think they're the most important and most valuable resource that any learning community has.
Yeah, I want to piggyback off that, and especially as it relates to the Young People's Project, I think something all math classes, and I would say in any discipline you're teaching students, is this idea of discussion. And you say discussion, and that's easy to do, right? Discussion in English language arts, in an ELA class. Discussion in math, that's probably less of something that's done all over the place. So like, how do you have a discussion with mathematics? How do you get a classroom to basically talk about the math that we're trying to understand in a way where the Algebra Project fame people talk? And I was just reading an article maybe 2 days ago, and it was talking about disciplined improvisation. So if you've been to an improv comedy show, so much happens that it's unexpected, but it all connects at the end of the day, right? So imagine math teachers equipped to be able to improv in their classrooms, and what's creating the discourse and the discussion are students trying to make sense of something. So a variable is actually a really good idea of where a lot of just ideas come up. And so if you want to know how to do it really well, I would recommend to try to find a young people's project site near you, because the math literacy workers who are high school students, when they are teaching young people, what we like to sort of train them to do is, when a student says something, and say a question is like, okay, we're trying to figure out what 2 times 6 is, and if they say 35, what's easy to do is just say no, that's wrong. But a lot more can be gained if you have a dialogue, a discourse, and open it up to the whole classroom to share about, well, what does this really mean? What was actually the student thinking about? And creating a community where relationships and connecting with one another to get to some facilitated solution. So that's one thing I say that's probably one of the most important but missing pieces inside of math education spaces, is being able to allow students to explore the ideas in their minds, and having a facilitator present to help guide what the discourse is. And like I'm saying, if you need any recommendations where to find how to do it good, even algebra project classrooms too. Algebra project classrooms and young people's project math literacy outreach sites.
I didn't know, sorry, I'm comfortable with wait time, so I didn't know, Albert, if you were gonna jump in. Thank you so much. That's so helpful, especially for the folks who are with us right now, and they're going to be finishing teaching later today or tomorrow. Those are tangible things that they could bring into their practice. So we appreciate that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, for me, I would just say that this exploration of how young people come to perceive themselves to own something. So we didn't own mathematics, but we did own a piece of how it was taught to us. We owned a piece of how we were able to articulate how we learned. And we owned enough of it that we were able to actually challenge mathematics in different times, where Bob would let us know it was, in a lot of instances, it was no one way to learn something. But if you did have an alternate way, what you had to understand was the discipline of math, that it was a certain set of rules that if this theory that you have, if it holds true every time based on this certain set of rules, then you absolutely figured out the way that you know how to learn this math, right? So it wasn't what was written on the chalkboard. It wasn't what you were seeing in the textbook. And a lot of times it wasn't even what Bob was saying to you in front of the room. It was this ownership of exploration that allowed you to say, I don't understand that like this, but I do understand it like this. And if my theory holds true each time within this set of rules, then I discovered the way that I can learn and teach mathematics according to my own learning style, which speaks to that people talk that Cliff was talking about, where you could talk math in the simplest language. I see this as this. And then you could go feature talk, which is another algebra project thing where you're talking about it in more detail, where this shade of red is a little bit different than that shade of red because of these things. And then in some places you could not know how to articulate it with words at all. And you had symbolic representation where you could draw signs that say, this is what this looks like and means to me. And so that was like the ownership that was like in some ways given to us, but in a lot of ways claimed by the young people when given the opportunity to say that I want to do something different, or I want to have a little more freedom in the way that I learn, and having a program and a curriculum and an approach that allowed that, also allowed that ownership to like build community where we wasn't just a bunch of kids learning math in this different way. Like now we raising families together. and we got 30-year long friendships, and a lot that came from that piece of ownership, but also this collective ownership of us as young people for the first time in our lives, owning something, but then owning a piece of it with a lot of other people who look like us and come right from where we do.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the beautiful privileges of being an educator, is when your students solve something in a way that you haven't ever thought of. Like you and your math teacher colleagues, right? Or a student will represent something in a pictorial geometric representation that, you know, crystallizes everything, that you're like, wow, I never even thought about that way. You know, I love those moments. And so I appreciate you all highlighting that. And I know Cassandra has a next question for us.
I do. And so I want to direct folks to the chat. There's some great resources that have been put there as our panelists have been sharing, if you're interested in going deeper. And I want to be mindful of the time. However, I have a really important question, because I know for me, I was so excited after coming back from DC to connect deeper with the Young People's Project and Flagway. You were planning a tournament in Ohio. I was like, we're close to Ohio, we could drive there. And then the pandemic came, and it really just turned our world upside down. So I'm really interested in understanding how the pandemic has impacted your work, but more so thinking about how virtual learning in mathematics has impacted mathematics as a civil right, and who gets to participate, who gets to learn, and this new exacerbating of challenges that were already there. And now we have this added layer.
I can start. Oh, you want to start, Maisha?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, so the pandemic, so, you know, especially in education, right? What the pandemic allowed to happen was, you know, in very slow motion, the pandemic allowed for all of us to examine all the different pieces that are making the education system, you know, roll, because everything was paused, right? We got to examine and to put, you know, analysis on everything, and we had a decision. We had a decision to make. We see the problems for what they are, and use this moment to fix them, so that when we come out of the pandemic, we can change it, or we just leave the things the way they were. For a lot of parts of, you know, education, things have been trying to stay as normal. And before Bob transitioned, he wrote a piece that talked about, you know, returning to normal is not good enough. And I urge everyone to go read that. And so, you know, for at least at the Young People's Project, I think it was one needed piece for us, because it allowed us to figure out more ways and how to get access to young people in more places, and be able to, while we're in this pandemic, where sometimes at the beginning, where we had to teach young people online, was to bring joy back into math, but also just school in general, because students were just having a really bad time going to school on the computer. And like I was saying earlier, what's more cool than to have you know, a teenager who is about 9th grade, 10th grade, teaching you, instead of maybe your teacher that doesn't even know how to use a computer, and you guys are, you know, playing with animations on Zoom, and you know, you're using Jamboard to play math games, and actually playing Flagway tournaments online. So, you know, I think for a lot of students, you know, throughout the pandemic, the young people, the high school students at YPP, because they were in school as well, got to examine the schools and how they were living their lives as students, to change their, their younger peers' experiences, because they knew exactly what was wrong, so therefore they knew how to fix it. And that's what we were talking about earlier about, well, the people who are having the problem should be right at the center of solving, bringing up solutions to, make things better. And that's what I think a lot of the young people at Young People's Project done, as well as in the Algebra Project, to create, learning experiences that, stay true to joy, passion, and, collaboration, of many things that, the pandemic has stopped. But at least one of the things that I can say the Young People's Project is, and the young people there, has continued to try to make sure that there was joy and learning, but also doing math.
Yeah, I can just maybe add in terms of, you asked a question about sort of the inequities that the pandemic revealed in education. And so to me, it's just as you said, it revealed what was already happening. Going back to my dad and his work, he was the first person, or he was the person that made me aware of thinking about education in terms of how our right to an education is granted in the country, through our state constitutions, not through our federal constitution, and the ways in which education functions to perpetuate a caste system. And so he talked about sharecropper education a lot in the earlier days of the Algebra Project. And then he talked about, I'm sort of thinking through my phases of listening to him talk and what he would say. So there was a long time he talked about sharecropper education, and then he came across a book by James Bryant Conant called Slums and Suburbs. And Conant was he's a former Harvard president and the founder of ETS. And he wrote a book in the 1950s. And he said in that book, what I just said about how the country, his research led him to the understanding that the country North and South after the Civil War agreed to keeping, using the language of the 1950s, the Negro in a tight caste system, and that the clearest manifestation of that caste system, of the America's caste system, is in its education system. And so everything that we've been talking about really boils down to that, is how do you understand that our education system, which is the tool in the country that we think about having a role to play in conferring freedom and opportunity for people in the country, but that it does that, but that it also functions to perpetuate a caste system. And what does it mean to really reckon with that? And to understand that in our day-to-day, from wherever we sit, whether we're preparing new teachers to teach, or do they understand that that's the system that they're facing, right? And how do they think about their role in relationship to that? How do students think about their role in relationship to that? I mean, like every educator, almost by necessity, is a freedom fighter, right? In that sense, every student by necessity is a freedom fighter in that context, right? Given that that's how education functions today in our society. And so COVID, I think, sort of put that in stark light, that that's the reality of what we're dealing with.
Thank you so much for your responses to that question. We had a few more that we don't have time for, but I appreciate the conversation that has come out of our time together today. Again, there are some great resources in the chat, and we'll be sending out a follow-up email to everyone who registered that will have the link to the article that Cliff mentioned, perhaps the book that was mentioned as well. And I just want to again say thank you all. Your work has truly influenced our work with Ready to Learn here in Pittsburgh, and the legacy of Bob Moses and his writings and teachings are also deeply influencing my work as a scholar and a practitioner. Dr. Kokka?
Yeah, we just wanted to really thank you for the privilege of getting to hear from you all and for your willingness to share with us. And there will be some follow-up in terms of future events next week that Cassandra is involved with. There is an event, I believe, next Thursday. Am I right, Cassandra? And the School of Ed will also be hosting a Freedom and Justice gathering. We called it a social justice curriculum fair last year in April 13th from 4 to 7. So there'll be a follow-up email about that also. But I mean, I know that I'm feeling fired up and inspired, and we are all freedom fighters, like you said, Maisha. And so I'm really going to be taking that with me today. And so we thank you again. And we wanted to invite Dr. Dancy to share some final words with us.
Okay, don't go away just yet. There's some more exciting announcements. If you're new to the Pitt Center for Urban Education's events, the Lunch and Learn is an important engagement and reflection of the center's mantra, learn, share, and transform. Learn speaks to our research and study purposes. Share speaks to our commitment to public service and resource sharing and providing thinkers forum to do the same. And transform speaks to our aims of educational and societal transformation with essential attention to power relationships. Our continued condolences to Maisha Moses, family, friends, and all who loved and were touched by Bob Moses and his work. Our thanks to our panelists, Maisha, Cliff, and Albert, for their time, their labor, their intellect, and their embedded challenge to us to carry this mantle of justice and freedom. We are grateful to Laura Roop for moving and beautiful reflection, and our moderators, Cassandra, Brentley, and Kari Kokka, for their thoughtful facilitation. And special thanks to our ASL interpreters, Yea, April, Joshua, and Charity in particular for her labor in connecting us to ASL support. We thank our colleagues in the Center for Urban Education and the School of Education, our faculty, staff, and students whose labor enabled this event, namely Greg Latshaw, Caitlin Zurcher, Swain Yovaveros, and our student workers, Nikaya Washington Butler and Sophia Rodriguez Berno. I'm excited to invite you to join us for 2 upcoming events in the first week of February. The first is a follow-up to this event in which we invite local communities to reflect on our current challenges, circumstances, possibilities, and develop plans of action. The first is Thursday, February 3rd, 2022 at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We'll continue the conversation we started here, but more specifically about the Center for Urban Education's own math justice program, Ready to Learn. Drawing from principles like those in the Algebra Project and Young People's Project, our own program is making a tremendous intervention in the lives of youth, families, and communities. We hope to share what we have learned and think with communities about the potential and future of this program. The second event is one in our Responding to Reality series, which calls our attention to current and urgent issues. On Saturday, February 5th, 2022 at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, youth who organized walkouts in their schools to call for remote school options and against COVID protocols will join our School of Education Center for Urban Education to talk about their commitments and activisms. We will be joined by youth organizers from Boston, Chicago, and the Bronx, so you do not want to miss that. And to make sure you don't, take a moment to go to our website, q.pitt.edu. That's cue.pitt.edu pitt.edu and click Contact on our main menu to receive information about our events. While you are there, learn more about us, our upcoming events, and read our newsletter. Finally, thanks to all of you for your attendance and energy in this important conversation, for your engagement of the panel's ideas, for asking questions, and for reacting in our chat. Take good care and have a good day.